By the summer of 1555, the southern edge of Russia was a fault line, pressure building on both sides. On one side stood a Russian state that was no longer content to survive. It wanted to organize, centralize, fortify towns, rivers, supply lines, muskets stacked in rows. On the other side rode the Crimean Khanate, heirs 2 centuries of steppe warfare, fast horses, composite bows, armies that lived off movement itself, backed by the Ottoman Empire, the largest military machine the Mediterranean world had ever seen. That confrontation didn't come out of nowhere. 3 years earlier, in 1552, Ivan IV took Kazan. If that sounds like just another conquest, it really wasn't. Kazan was the lock on the Volga. By taking it, Moscow didn't just gain territory. It snapped the spine of the old Mongol order. For more than 2 centuries, Russian princes had paid tribute to steppe rulers who claimed descent from Genghis Khan. After Kazan fell, centuries of political gravity flipped. Control of the Volga meant Russian troops, supplies, and settlers could now push south with relative safety, and that immediately put pressure on the remaining Tatar states, and that terrified Crimea. Devlet Giray knew this. He'd come to power in 1551 with the backing of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, and he understood that a passive Crimea would be a doomed Crimea. The fall of Kazan meant Astrakhan was next, and after that Crimea would be exposed, not surrounded by enemies in the modern sense, but slowly strangled. Fewer open routes north, fewer raids, fewer slaves, and slaves mattered. Every large Crimean raid could bring back thousands of captives. Men, women, children, chained together, marched south, and sold through Black Sea ports into Ottoman markets. That white gold kept the Khanate alive. But that system only worked if the wild fields, the Dikopol, remained open in this vast belt of grassland between Russian forests and the Crimean Peninsula had to stay lawless, undefended, and thinly settled. Russian forts, farming villages, or patrols creeping south were like weeds in a carefully maintained killing ground. If Moscow closed that space, Crimea would slowly suffocate. So Devlet Giray tried words first. After failing to crack Tula in 1552, a hard, ugly failure, he sent letters to Ivan. Letters were sent to Ivan IV, filled with polite language about peace and friendship. But buried inside was a familiar demand: tributes, not a large amount by steppe. Standards, but symbolically enormous. Paying it would mean admitting Moscow still stood below the heirs of the Golden Horde. Ivan's answer was no. That refusal closed the door. From that point on, everyone involved knew what was coming. The only question was where and when. Early in 1555, Russian border commanders started noticing things that didn't feel normal: larger Tatar gatherings, units assembling earlier than usual, riders moving in organized columns. This wasn't a hit-and-run season anymore. Then the rumors appeared. Word spread that Devlet Giray was riding east toward the Caucasus to punish the Circassians near Pyatigorsk. The Crimean Khans had been fighting Circassian tribes for generations. But on the steppe, rumor itself was a weapon. The real target. Everyone suspected it, but no one could prove it, was Moscow. Ivan IV didn't panic. He did what steppe armies hated most. He refused to chase shadows. Instead of pulling his main army south or east, he anchored it behind the Oka River. That river mattered: wide, slow-moving, difficult to cross under pressure.
Ow.
Along its banks stood fortified towns, artillery positions, supply depots like a layered shield. Then Ivan sent forward a strong reconnaissance and interception force, large enough to fight if needed, but not so large that its destruction would be catastrophic. Neither side fully understood what the encounter would become. Crimeans still believed speed would solve everything. The Russians believed depth and discipline could blunt even the fastest cavalry. Both assumptions were about to be tested. It was 2 military systems in mid-transition running headfirst into each other. Neither side was fully old world anymore, and neither was fully modern. That's what made the encounter so volatile. On the Russian side, you had an army halfway through reform, still relying on traditional noble cavalry, but now backed up by something new and unsettling: permanent infantry armed with firearms. On the Crimean side, you had the peak of nomadic warfare refined over centuries, now reinforced with Ottoman gunpowder technology. The Russian force was commanded by Ivan Vasilievich Sheremetev, the Elder, veteran voivode, trusted with forward operations. Old chronicles like to inflate numbers. They talk about 13,000 to 17,000 Russians. But modern historians, especially Vitaly Penskoy, argue those figures simply don't hold up. Based on logistics, pay records, and deployment patterns, the number of troops actually engaged at Sud-Bishay was likely closer to 7,000 to 9,000 men. Let's break down what Sheremetev actually had with him. The backbone of his army was the Dedi Boyarsky, literally sons of Bojars. Think of them as Russia's service nobility, not full-time professional soldiers, but men who owed military service in exchange for land. The key difference is that these men fought to protect land they actually lived on. At Sud-Bishay, these men are the heavy hitters. They wore mail armor or early plate, iron helmets, carried sabers, bows, and increasingly firearms designed for mounted use. Unlike Tatar horsemen who avoided close combat whenever possible, Dedi Boyarsky were expected to close distance and fight hand-to-hand if needed. The problem was organization. These units were raised locally, tied to regions rather than a centralized command structure. Discipline depended heavily on the man giving orders at that exact moment against a fluid enemy. That's a weakness waiting to be exposed. The real wildcard, though, the piece that didn't belong to the old steppe versus forest script, was the Streltsy. Formed only a few years earlier, around 1550, the Streltsy were Russia's first permanent infantry force. It carried long arquebuses and heavy bardishes, large axe blades that doubled as gun rests and close combat weapons. If cavalry was the muscle, the Streltsy were the spine. A disciplined volley of arquebus fire could punch holes straight through a cavalry charge before horses even reached spear range. Against nomadic horse archers, this was poison. But Streltsy came with a risk. They don't move fast. They don't retreat cleanly if they're flanked. If cavalry gets around them, the protection vanishes fast. Firearms without space are just clubs. Supporting all of this were Cossack detachments, mainly from the Don and Dnieper regions. These men were the eyes and ears of the army, scouts, raiders, skirmishers. They understood steppe warfare instinctively. They knew how Tatars thought, how they feinted, how they lured enemies into traps. Without Cossacks, Sheremetev would have been blind. Even with all that, the Russian force was small, because coming toward them was Devlet Guri, and his army was enormous by comparison. Traditional sources talk about 60,000 Crimean warriors. Modern estimates cut that down to something closer to 40,000 to 50,000 men. But even at the low end, you're still looking at a minimum 4-to-1 advantage, possibly 5-to-1. The Crimean force was built around light Tatar cavalry, men who lived in the saddle. Each warrior typically brought 2 or 3 horses, swapping mounts throughout. The day with them were Ottoman janissaries, professional infantry armed with firearms and, more importantly, field artillery. Steppe warfare traditionally avoided sieges and heavy guns. Now suddenly the Crimean army could pound defensive positions instead of just surrounding them. This meant Sud-Bishay wasn't just going to be a cavalry clash. It could turn into a rolling siege in open terrain. Up to June of 1555, the safe option for Ivan IV would have been obvious. Sit behind the Oka River line, stack troops at the crossings, let the Crimean army come north, exhaust itself, and then fight on prepared ground. That's how Russia had survived steppe invasions for generations. Instead, Ivan sent Ivan Sheremetev south straight into the wild fields, marching deep toward Circassian lands in the general direction of Perekop, the narrow gateway to Crimea itself. The logic is don't wait to be hit, go find the enemy. If Devlet Guri is truly heading toward the Circassians, fine. Sheremetev can harass or withdraw. But if that's a lie, this forward push might be the only way to uncover it before Moscow is in danger. As the Russian column pushes south, scouts fan out far ahead, mostly Cossacks, and they spot something that doesn't fit. A huge baggage train. Thousands upon thousands of animals, horses, camels, moving at the pace of the slowest wagon, supplies stacked for weeks, food, spare weapons, fodder, the kind of train you only assemble when you're committing to something big. The Russians hit it fast. The Russians seized tens of thousands of animals. Sources talk about around 60,000 horses and camels combined, plus wagons of food, spare weapons, and supplies meant to sustain an army for weeks. This was the lifeline of Devlet Giray's entire campaign. First, that baggage train answers a question Ivan desperately needed answered. No one drags a logistical tale like this unless they're marching on something important. It's feeding a full-scale invasion, the one that aimed north toward Moscow. Second, it traps Sheremtiv in a nightmare choice. He now controls an incredible prize. Enough animals and supplies to cripple the Crimean advance. But those same animals slow him to a crawl. Horses need guarding. Captured camels don't move fast. The Russian column suddenly becomes heavy, stretched, and vulnerable. And somewhere nearby is the main Crimean army. 40,000 or more men who will absolutely want this baggage back. For a moment, the sensible move would have been to turn north immediately. Dump what can't be moved, save the army, deliver the intelligence to Moscow. But that's not what Sheremtiv does. Through captured prisoners, what the Russians called living tongues, because they cut information loose, he learned something worse. Devlet Giray's main force has already passed him. The Crimean army is riding north fast, heading straight toward Tula. If Sheremtiv retreats, he saves his men, but Moscow may pay the price. If he stays put, he gets crushed. There's only one option left that even might matter. He turns around. Instead of fleeing north, Sheremtiv pivots and chases the Khan's army from behind. It's the most dangerous choice available. He's slower. He's outnumbered. He's moving toward an enemy that doesn't expect him to be there, but will react violently once it realizes what's happening. The gamble is simple to state and brutal to execute. Hit the Crimean rear hard enough to force Devlet Giray to stop. Even a pause of a few days could mean everything for Ivan IV, who is still pulling forces together further north. Sheremtiv knows he's not meant to win a field battle. He's meant to buy time with blood and nerve. The kind of decision that only makes sense if you accept responsibility for what happens beyond your own command. And that tells you something important about this moment in Russian military culture. Early on the morning of the 22nd of June, Sheremtiv finally catches the rear elements of Devlet Giray's army near the village of Sudbishi in what's now the Oriol region. The Russians have around 7,000 men still with them. Cavalry, streltsy, a scattering of Cossacks. Sheremtiv orders an immediate attack. The first clash goes better than anyone could have hoped. The Russian Dedi Boyarsky, heavy cavalry trained. To crash into close combat, slam into the Tatar rearguard. These aren't the elite forward units of the Crimean host. It's just flank and rear security, but they're still experienced steppe fighters. Even so, the Russian charge hits hard enough to break them. In the chaos, the Russians seize the banners of princes from the Shurin clan. One of the most prestigious noble families in the Crimean Khanate. That's not just a trophy. Losing a banner is a public humiliation. News travels fast. When word reaches Devlet Giray, it does exactly what Sheremtiv hoped and feared. The Khan doesn't panic just for a moment, but enough to issue the one order he cannot take back. He halts the march on Tula. Then he turns the entire army around. And now, the scale of the problem reveals itself all at once. What had been a successful strike against a tail becomes a confrontation with the whole body. Somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 Crimean and Ottoman troops pivot and begin closing in. In minutes, the Russians go from hunters to prey. In the violent, confused fighting that follows, even Sheremtiv is badly wounded and thrown from his horse. Whether he's knocked unconscious or simply vanishes from sight hardly matters. The effect is immediate. A rumor spreads that the commander is dead. In an army already stretched thin, that rumor is lethal. Units guarding the captured loot, remember, they're hauling tens of thousands of animals. Panic first. Cossack detachments, never the most disciplined, scatter. Men start riding northeast, anywhere but here. By midday, a large part of the Russian force is gone. What remains is a hard core, somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 men, depending on whose account you trust, mostly streltsy and a handful of boyar cavalry who refuse to leave. They're tired and surrounded, and they're about to be erased unless someone takes control. This is where Alexei Danilovich Basmanov steps forward alongside Stefan Sidorov. Basmanov will later become infamous as one of Ivan the Terrible's closest enforcers during the Oprichnina. But here at Sudbeshi, you see the reason he rises at all. He doesn't try to restore the original plan or chase retreating units. Instead of fleeing, he gathers whoever will still listen. Basmanov gathers what's left and pulls them into a dense oak forest, a Dubrava, bordered by a deep ravine. Trees. Break up cavalry charges. The ravine seals one flank. For the first time that day, the Crimean army can't just flow around them. Then they build a fortress. They fell trees at the forest edge and drag them into position. Branches facing outward to form a body, a jagged barrier that horses refuse to charge through. They haul remaining wagons into rough circles in half moons, creating a makeshift wagonberg, what Russians called a gulia gorod. And then there's the detail that archaeology later confirms. In 2021, researchers found scattered iron caltrops, four-pointed spikes embedded in the soil around the site. You toss one on the ground and no matter how it lands, a spike points straight up. Step on it barefoot, you're done. Step on it with a horse at full gallop, and the charge is over before it really begins. And this is where Devlet Gyra starts to run into a problem he didn't expect. For the rest of the 22nd of June, and then through the long grinding hours of the 23rd, he threw his army at that forest 3 times. The first assault is classic steppe warfare. Tatar cavalry surges forward, horses accelerating, riders shouting, expecting fear to do half the work for them. Instead, the front ranks hit the caltrops. Horses scream and rear. Some collapse outright. Others spin sideways, crashing into the riders behind them. The abatis, the sharpened tree barriers, finish the job. Momentum dies in seconds. What should have been a rolling wave turns into a tangled knot of wounded animals and dismounted men. So the Khan escalates. For the second attack, he commits forces the Russians are not used to seeing this far north. Ottoman janissaries backed by artillery. This matters. The Crimean Khanate is tied to the Ottoman Empire, and this is one of the moments where that connection shows up on the battlefield. Cannons are dragged into position. Shots thunder into the forest. Trees splinter, bark flies, smoke fills the ravine. But the terrain betrays the attackers. The oak trunks soak up impact. The ravine breaks the angles of fire. Cannonballs lose energy before they can do real damage. And behind the wagons and tree trunks, the Russian streltsy infantry with matchlock firearms do what they're trained to do. Each musket shot isn't fast, but at close range it punches through armor and flesh alike. The janissaries take losses they didn't expect. The guns fall quiet sooner than planned. Still, Devlet Gyra isn't done. The third assault is the worst one. This is hand-to-hand fighting right at the edge of the forest. Sabers clash with axes. Spears jam into bodies at arm's length. Men are dragged over wagon wheels and hacked apart in the mud. Chronicles from the Ottoman side later describe the Russians fighting like wild boars and mad like dogs. Think about the numbers here. The Russians inside the forest are outnumbered maybe 20 to 1, 2,000, perhaps 5,000 at most, holding against tens of thousands, and yet they don't break. By the night of June 23rd, something subtle had shifted. The forest still stands. The wagon fort still holds. And the Khan's army, huge as it is, has spent 2 days bleeding against a position that refuses to collapse. Then news arrives. Scouts report that Ivan IV's main army is moving south from Tula. Fresh troops, heavy forces. Not hours away, maybe. Days, but close enough to matter. Suddenly, Devlet Gyra sees the shape of a disaster forming. If he stays, he risks being caught between Basmanov's men in the forest and the Tsar's advancing army. That's not a risk you take lightly. even with superior numbers. So he orders the withdrawal. The army pulls back toward the steppe, leaving behind the battlefield, the wounded, and the plan to strike Moscow that year. For a long time, Sudbishi lived only on paper. Old chronicles copied and recopied with gaps where pages were lost and numbers that felt almost symbolic. Not until very recently. That changed in 2021, that summer. Teams from the Institute of Archaeology of the Russian Academy of Sciences went into the field around the Gostilovsky ravine. The place scholars had long suspected but never fully confirmed. What they found removed any remaining doubt. In a single excavation season, they pulled nearly 3,000 artifacts out of the soil. Almost 2,900 pieces of metal, stone, and lead, packed into a relatively tight area. For a 16th century battlefield, that density is extraordinary. Most sites from that era give you scattered hints. This one speaks in a shout, and the ground itself tells you why. The artifacts cluster along the forest edge near the ravine, exactly where Basmanov's improvised fortress stood. That alone matches the written accounts, but then you start looking at what was found, and the picture sharpens fast. First, the ammunition. Hundreds of arrowheads. Heavy armor-piercing types associated with Russian cavalry mixed in with lighter Tatar heads designed for speed and volume. Alongside them, lead musket balls flattened or torn. The kind that deform when they hit wood or bone. This isn't incidental. Fire. It's sustained shooting. Long enough, intense enough that Streltsy muskets weren't just present, they were central. Then there are the tools, sickles, hoes, axes, not lost farm gear, but objects found inside the battle layer itself. That matters. It means men were cutting trees, digging earth, and reinforcing positions during the fighting. Imagine that for a moment. Smoke drifting through the oaks, arrows coming in. And someone is still hacking at roots to deepen a trench because they know another assault is coming. That detail alone makes the chronicles feel suddenly very honest. Personal equipment turns up too. Fragments of mail armor, pieces of helmets, broken blades. For centuries, historians reconstructed what Dedi Boyarsky wore, mostly from icons and church art, stylized symbolic images. Now there's iron in hand, real weight, real damage. You can tell which parts took the hits, and the scale of loss becomes harder to ignore. Russian sources suggest more than 1,000 boyars died at Sudbishi, along with large numbers of Streltsy, whose names never made it into the record. That's not a skirmish cost. That's the price of holding a line that should not have been held, especially when you remember what they were stopping. Devlet Gire, moving with something closer to 60,000 people. Fighters, auxiliaries, support, rolling north like a storm front. If Sheremetev and Basmanov hadn't slowed him for those 2 days, the Khan could have crossed the OKP before Ivan IV finished gathering his main army. Moscow and Tula would have been exposed. The kind of catastrophe Russia had lived through before. That's why later generations quietly started calling Sudbishi the Russian Thermopylae. The logic was identical. A small force absorbs destruction, so a country doesn't have to. The consequences ripple outward from there. Alexei Basmanov walks away from Sudbishi transformed. Ivan IV notices him. A commander who doesn't run, who can organize chaos, who understands firearms and fortifications. In a court where the Tsar increasingly distrusts old boyar families, that kind of loyalty and competence is gold. Basmanov rose fast, becoming one of the architects of Oprichnina, and in a grim twist typical of Ivan's reign, he eventually becomes one of its victims. Sudbishi launches him, but it doesn't save him. Sheremetev's story bends the other way. He survives his wounds. He did his duty, but court politics aren't kind to damaged heroes. Over time, he's pushed aside, caught in factional struggles, his role quietly minimized. The battlefield remembered him better than Moscow did, yet the most lasting legacy is institutional. Sudbishi becomes a proving ground, a brutal experiment for the Guliagorod system. Mobile wagon forts, infantry firepower, field engineering under pressure. Everything that worked here gets studied, argued over, refined. 17 years later at Melody in 1572. Prince Voratinsky applied the same principles on a larger scale with consequences that permanently reshaped the southern frontier of Russia. If you're interested in how these early experiments with firearms and field fortifications eventually destroyed the Crimean threat altogether, the story continues at Melody. That video is already on the channel. If you enjoy this kind of evidence-based storytelling, where numbers, strategy, and real consequences matter, hit like and subscribe. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you think we missed something or got something wrong, call us out. That's how these discussions get better. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next video tomorrow.